and welcome to the show. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, before I introduce my guest this week, just a note about two locals events coming up this week. Both of them are happening on Tuesday, May the 14th in the evening, and they're both free. One is in Birmingham and one is in Wolverhampton. So if you're in those areas, the one in Bournemouth is just outside Bournemouth, I understand. But if you are interested in coming along, they're totally free. If you want to meet like-minded people, it'd be great to see you. Please do write to locals@newcultureforum.org.uk, and we will send you the details of where and when. So that's this coming Tuesday, 14th of May, in Bournemouth and Wolverhampton. Now, you must be aware, not just by listening to this program, but also from day in, day out, in the media, in our universities, the basic apparent truism of our time is that all of Britain's prosperity is based on a history of colonialism and slavery. This has almost become indisputable, at least in terms of the ongoing media narrative. But is it actually true? The fact is, fortunately, we have a new publication that's just come out, which in fact really looks at this and takes issue with it. I'm very, very pleased that we have the author of that, who is Dr. Kristian Niemietz, and he's from the IEA, that's the Institute of Economic Affairs, of which he is editorial director. Kristian, I'm sorry, it's Niemietz, isn't
it?
Yes, right. Yes, of course.
Heard worse.
This is a very important book. It's called Imperial Measurement, and it's basically looking at the fact, is it not? I'm just briefly summarising it here. Was our prosperity all based entirely on the exploitation that came with colonialism and slavery? And it's right to say that you have done a kind of cost-benefit analysis, yes. Purely economic.
Right.
Can you tell us how you, first of all, what was the main conclusion that you came to with this?
Well, the short answer is no, that's not what made Britain rich. That's not what made the West rich. It made, at best, a minor contribution, possibly none at all. And that's because the numbers are simply not big enough. If you look at the profits that were made in the empire, in the colonies, if you add it all up, you get numbers that are big enough to make some individual families very rich, but not to make a massive contribution to the development of the country as a whole. So if you look at the industrialization process, at the whole, all the investment that was going on at the time, 18th, 19th century, we're talking about colossal volumes of capital investment, and the profits from slavery, profits from imperialism, profits from that were made in various ways in the empire, they were just nowhere near big enough to explain much of that.
Well, I mean, can you give us an idea of the proportions? I mean, when you say, so what could you attribute to colonialism then, in terms of the income to the country, in terms of trade?
Right. Well, it's hard to come up with a definitive number because there's massive gaps in the data. It's just that we know for a start that trade in general, overseas trade, was far less important than it is now. So as a proportion of the size of the economy, the importance of imports and exports, and foreign investment was far smaller than today, and for obvious reasons. So all the technologies that we now use that sustain modern day trade volumes were not invented until much later. So container shipping, that wasn't a thing until the 1950s and so on. Yeah. So trade as a share of GDP was less than half of what it is now. And even then, most of Britain's trade at the time wasn't with the colonies, but it was outside of the empire, mostly with other industrializing countries, Western Europe and North America later.
Oh, I see. So in fact, there is this view, or should I say the impression that's given, is that it was entirely down to our colonies. This was actually where we traded, that we captured markets effectively.
Yes.
And at great cost. Mm-hmm. That view, which I've just described there, is just basically embedded everywhere now, isn't it? I mean, mm-hmm. How difficult is it to actually challenge that? Because you're doing it with this book. Is this entirely new, what you're doing, or have people tried this before?
Oh, yes, many times. It's a very old debate. You can go back, in fact, to the 18th century when Adam Smith was already challenging the idea that it was the colonies that made Britain rich. He said, we're probably making a loss. We probably shouldn't have an empire. He was making this argument, of course, unlike me, not against woke progressives, but against actual imperialists who said this is what our prosperity depends on. And he, as an economist, the father of economics, said, no, that's not what this is. So the debate is very old. It just took different forms at different times. So the idea that from the left, the idea that capitalism has kind of an original sin in the form of colonial exploitation. That comes from the 1940s. There was a historian, Eric Williams, who wrote a book, Capitalism and Slavery, which was very influential at the time. So that became the Williams thesis, as it was called.
Williams-Marx thesis, wasn't it? The Williams-Karl Marx?
Yes, I call it, in the book, I call it the Marx-Williams thesis, just to point out that, firstly, you can go further back if you want to. Eric Williams was doing it in a more systematic way. Karl Marx just asserted it, but yes, you can trace it back even to him. And I also wanted to make the anti-capitalist character of that thesis clearer. So yes, Eric Williams then came up with this book, and which was initially his doctoral thesis, became influential. He made a more modest case than a typical Guardian article today would do. He said this is one of the investment streams, the profits from the plantations in the Caribbean. That is a part of what financed industrial expansion in Britain. That later got popularized and turned into something more extreme. Yeah, you then have from the 60s onwards, you had the student radicals. They were turning this into a stronger version, saying our entire wealth is basically built on this. And then you had a breakthrough again, or renewed interest in this in the course of BLM mania, so the Black Lives Matter protests.
Yes, what has brought about, what exactly has brought about this sudden interest, if you like, in empire? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is it that?
It's clearly that. Or you could say maybe it started a few years earlier with the Great Awakening. So I think it was Eric Kaufman who did this media analysis where he looks at how often are words like empire, slavery, colonies and so on, how often are they mentioned in the British media? And he shows for a lot of those terms, you see a big increase starting in the first half roughly of the last decade, so the early 2010s. Use of colonialism, I think, doubled or trebled. So it started before. It's just that in 2020, when you had the BLM protests,
yes,
they spilled over from America. They were initially just a copy. It was copy and paste. The woke progressives here saw what was happening in North America and just copied it, even some of the slogans, some of the hands up, don't shoot, slogans that don't really work that well if you have a generally unarmed police force, and initially just copied and pasted it. But then they made it specific to Britain by starting to make this about the empire and the early slave trade.
Yes.
And the toppling of that statue in Bristol, the Colston statue, that was, from then on, you could say, empire was suddenly everywhere. So if I had written this 10 years earlier, I'm guessing, it would probably have triggered some Guardian journalists, but there would have been very little interest in it. It's really the last 4 years that this has exploded.
There's been far more interest this time.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting this, because you do it, as you say, on the basis, not on some cultural basis, but on a strict economic basis. That's what you're looking at here in this book, and on a cost-benefit analysis. What, therefore, Kristian, would be the costs in that situation? If you're trying to see what effect, how much prosperity really came about because directly of slavery and colonialism, what would the costs be that you'd be looking at?
Well, empires are expensive. And that's the cost. They lead to, so the cost of military conquest is very high. The cost of ongoing occupation and of administering an overseas empire. And we see this even today when you have troops stationed elsewhere, that's always, that costs a lot of money. and in the same way protecting naval trade and all that. These are the reasons why Britain had higher military expenditure than any of the neighboring countries, or most of the neighboring countries, and was a high tax economy by the standards of the time. So we don't think about it in those terms, because public spending in the 19th century, of course, much lower than now. If we had the tax burden of the 19th century today, that sounds like a dream. But by the standards of the time, it was pretty high. I think the second highest in Europe. And the empire, the military spending, the administrative spending, that was a part of it. Yeah. So I've seen one estimate where a historian tries to simulate what would have happened if the empire had been dissolved in the middle of the 19th century, and what if military spending had been cut to French or German levels. And these authors say if that had happened, the tax burden could have been slashed by about a quarter.
Really?
That's a lot of money, and that could have been invested in other things.
Yeah. And so presumably we would have carried on, just as you say earlier, we were trading mostly with our neighbours, or with Europe, whatever. So basically we could have looked further afield and traded without the panoply of empire.
With some of the colonies, definitely. Say that if it had been dissolved, if they hadn't been colonies anymore, then with some of them trade would have continued. We don't know to what extent, and that's part of the reason why I'm reluctant to come up with definitive numbers to say the contribution was 1% of GDP or minus 2%. That we don't know, because we don't
put a figure on it, though, don't you?
Well, maybe a range, so somewhere around zero. A couple of percentage points maybe could be slightly negative, could be slightly positive. Right. Cannot have been colossal in either direction. But it is one of the uncertainties is clearly we don't know what kind of trade relationships would have existed without the colonies. But some trade would have existed anyway. So nobody says there could have been no trade whatsoever with, say, India without an empire.
It sort of begs the question, does it not, that if that's the case, and it's very expensive, why did it go on for so long? Why did slavery, if you like, go on for so long?
Okay, as is often the case with policies that benefit specific interest groups, that can in itself be a reason to continue doing it if they are motivated to lobby for it. Because for the average Joe, it's not so clear what the cost is. If the cost is, say in the case of military spending, that is just that is tax money, that is widely dispersed. This is borne by virtually everybody. And the other way in which it was financed was by giving some companies trade monopolies or privileged positions where, say, some goods just couldn't be freely traded. They had to go through some company that had monopoly rights, and therefore consumer prices were higher than they would otherwise have been. That's part of the cost. That's not so obviously visible to the average consumer. That would only be if you, say, visit a neighboring country and you notice, oh, sugar is cheaper here. Why is that? Or tobacco is cheaper here. Why? And that's when you might notice these differences. But otherwise, it's just not very transparent.
So it's a matter of economic benefit to a few people.
Yes.
But then also presumably a sort of form of prestige.
Yes. Yes, there is clearly a vanity aspect that empire colonies were considered was something that you had to have as for international standing.
Yes,
and that's why in some cases we see that other European powers go very quickly from having virtually no colonies to suddenly wanting a big colonial empire for no obvious reason. It's not that something has changed in the structure of the economy. It's just that they want to keep up with the Joneses. So Kaiser Wilhelm II is the obvious example here. So I have to keep up with my British cousins. And
although that wasn't, but from what your book says, that was a bit of a failure, wasn't it?
Yes, that was the most clear-cut case of a total failure.
The Germany's
yes.
attempt. Yeah.
Yes.
See, this is how does Britain therefore compare with broadly its European neighbours in this sense? I mean, is it the same story? Did they not really benefit? I mean, whether you're talking about Spain or Portugal or all of these, or France, whatever.
I'd say Of all the cases that I'm looking at, the German colonies are the most obvious example of a total failure. So there, I mean, and not with the best will in the world, nobody could claim that was in any way a success. Made almost no contribution to trade, and they all the German colonial administrations had cost-benefit accounts that they ran. They kept the same accounting as private companies, and it was just clear. At least the larger ones of them, they all depended on subsidies. So that was on every measure, whether it's fiscal, trade-wise, or as a place where people could move to for settlements. In every respect, that was a complete failure. Belgium would be at the opposite end of the spectrum. They probably did benefit from having the Congo as a colony.
What was particular about Belgium and the Congo then?
Well, it's partly the political setup. So the Belgian parliament just refused to pay anything for it. And they were in a position to do that. They could say, not a penny from us. And they told the king, King Leopold II, that, look, you're the king. If you want to go and colonize someplace, we can't stop you, but you're not getting a penny. You have to raise your own money for this or use your own funds, which he did. And even so it was initially not even a colony of Belgium, the country, but more or less a private enterprise by King Leopold II, and it was also just very rich in minerals, in natural resources that had industrial applications and that were in very high demand at the time.
So, in fact, also it's probably the most infamous case, isn't it, of imperialism?
Yes.
You know, interestingly, you do also compare in the book the experience of, say, like Brazil. Again, this is something. If you were to be, your average teenager now in Britain, well, not just teenager, you would think Britain was the only people who ever colonized the world, and that they were particularly rapacious and evil and cruel. When it comes to South America, Central and South America, this idea that somehow or other you would become particularly rich because of colonialism, that would make Portugal and Spain the richest countries in the world, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, quite. So empires have of course, existed throughout history. Most of history is a history of conquest and then maybe losing it again later. So it's not that this was invented on the British Isles. It's just that what also happened is that at the same time as the British Empire was forming, the Industrial Revolution took off, and therefore you have this correlation that might make it tempting to think, oh, surely one of those caused the other. And well, if at all, it was of course the other way around, that you had because of industrialization and Britain being a pioneer for a while, that Britain had the industrial strength to do that, because that also affects, of course, your military strength.
Actually, I think as Camille Badenoch has actually spoken with approval about this book, hasn't she? I mean, she was saying it, and in fact, the point you make as well, it's that it wasn't so much colonialism, but it was our kind of ingenuity, our inventiveness, and indeed what you just mentioned, which is kind of idea of freedom, which has to be an institutional thing too, doesn't it?
Yes. And most economists, I think, would agree with that. At least nowadays, it's if you want to know why some countries are rich and others are poor, it clearly is mostly explained by the institutional setup. So to the extent that this can be measured, the World Bank and the OECD are trying to do this in several ways, that they try to measure the quality of institutions, say on a scale from 0 to 10 or whatever. And it's always the ones that are at the very top. So it's often Switzerland is usually number one. Sub-Saharan Africa usually at the lower end. Okay. And these are often very closely correlated to how rich or poor places are. Now, we can't apply those measures retroactively, but if you could, you would probably find that Britain in the 18th, 19th century was just a more well-run place than most of the world, had better institutions, had the rule of law, independent courts, probably not great by our standards today, but historically, surely by the standards of the time, well ahead of most. And unless economics functioned very differently then,
Yes.
surely that must have been what explained the Industrial Revolution starting here.
Yes. One thing as well I thought was quite interesting, because it was sort of an idea that was sort of in my head. You do actually address it. There is also this counter view. Well, not counter view, but it runs alongside it, that colonialism did indeed make non-Western countries poorer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you, from what I can gather, you do say there's something in that.
Yes, that could be a lot of truth in that. We don't know exactly, but it's just that. It's not that the places that weren't colonized are all super rich today. It doesn't work that way.
No.
But there's some evidence that places that were subject to colonial exploitation for longer or in a more intense way, that they still have worse institutions today compared to neighbors, maybe where colonial exploitation was more short-lived or less extreme. And it's not implausible, at least, to say, well, it could be that you had, in some places, you had European colonizers there who realized this is a hostile place for us. We can't deal with the tropical temperature and the diseases. We won't stay for long. We'll just make a quick buck. And you set up the kind of institutions that, that you would set up if that's your purpose, if that's what you want to achieve. You would not, whereas, say, the opposite end of the spectrum would be the settler colonies, so the North America example or New Zealand, where they basically just replicated the institutions from back home, maybe not even knowingly, but just because that was what they were used to, because there was more of an intention, we are in it for the long haul. We're going to make this a new home.
Yes. You mentioned right at the beginning, I think this is the nub of it, is it not? That you can't underestimate the entrenchment of the view that somehow we are just rich on the backs of other people, is really an anti-capitalist, that in fact, this is what is actually underneath it all. Absolutely, yes.
That is the mothership ideology here. And that's the reason why I got interested in this and why I probably wouldn't have 10 years ago. I remember we had these internal discussions at the outbreak of the BLM mania, that questions about whether we should engage in the culture war at all. So there are people on my side of the argument who would say, no, this is the culture war is kids stuff. We focus on pure economics. We talk about inflation and investment and productivity. Then we have people who say, well, no, our job is to defend the institutions of a free society more broadly. That does mean defending free markets, of course, but it also means defending free speech and freedom of assembly. And then woke progressives are automatically your opponents. Yeah. Whereas my take was a bit different. I said, well, if you look at the argument that they're making, say the Bristol statue topless, for example, one of them then got the chance to write about this in The Guardian, of course. They gave one of the organizers a platform so that he could explain and why they were doing this. And it was quite clearly an anti-capitalist rhetoric, saying a lot of the wealth that we enjoy is built on the basis of historical atrocities. Capitalism is built on historical atrocities. Black Lives Matter themselves, on their fundraising page, they said we are, they had various adjectives with which they described themselves. Anti-racism, of course, but also they did explicitly say we are an anti-capitalist organization. So the anti-capitalism, that was always there right from the start. So I said, well, it's not like you have the socialists on one side and the woke progressives on the other side. No, these are literally the same people. Yeah. I couldn't think of a single woke culture warrior who isn't also a massive anti-capitalist.
Oh, yes, no. This is why it gives obviously a lot of credibility to the argument. This is a kind of strange, perverted form of Marxism anyway.
Yes.
What's going on. This is all fascinating stuff, actually, Kristian. I wonder what you feel about this. You mentioned that some people did really, really well. And sure enough, they're the ones who are in the press, whether it's Coulson or whoever, Tate, people like that. But essentially, it meant very little in terms of real benefit to your average ordinary person,
Yes.
didn't the empire?
Yes, that's...
And I mean, the reason I say is that this sort of chimes with, it's entirely different context, around about the time of Brexit, for example. People would often criticise people who are Brexiteers as being very nostalgic for the empire. But I do not remember a huge sense of consciousness of the empire amongst ordinary people. It was like, I'm talking about working class people. I'm not talking about like middle or upper middle. They were maybe far more involved in it. But amongst ordinary people, yes, there was nostalgia for the Second World War. That's different. But for the empire, there was far less of a feeling for it.
No, I've never come across that either. I read about
Yes,
these
you
people
read
in The Guardian a lot,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
never actually see them
Yes.
anywhere.
Yes.
That's very much a projection.
And this is very much, therefore, this discussion, why it's in our faces so much, presumably is because it is a preoccupation of influential groups.
Yes, it's
In our institution.
it's elite group thing.
Yeah.
And that's where this all comes from, this renewed preoccupation with the empire that it is. You can quite easily turn it into a woke progressive, the West is bad narrative, and also into an anti-capitalist original sin story. Capitalism was born bad, the Western world was born bad, and you fuse them all together, and then you have a package view, and this is where this all comes from. And so if there was a large segment of the population, say, who were nostalgic about the empire or who were glorifying it, then I would see a case for the BLM, say, corrective story of some group saying actually it wasn't rosy, that there were also a lot of atrocities going on. That would be one thing. But as you said, it's the empire glorification, but that's actually missing. Who are these people? I never heard it before, and that's why I reject the accusation that I'm somehow starting a culture war by writing something about this. No, the culture war started really in the spring of 2020 when you had the BLM-inspired groups saying, we will now rename streets and buildings up and down the country. We will force our interpretation of history down everyone's throats, and we will put this on the agenda. And now everyone has to, essentially, they forced their own obsession on the whole country. It's a niche obsession, which was suddenly everywhere, and that's when the culture war started. It's not me starting it.
I would say it started a bit earlier than that, but it's certainly not the invention or the creation of anyone on the right, centre right, or whatever. No question about it. I mean, the idea that you would, for example, put forward not what you're doing, but the idea that you would put forward, say, like a positive case, right, for the empire, not just on an economic grounds, is pretty unthinkable and has been unthinkable for as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
It's just that people just think that argument is lost. That's gone, right? So this sort of attitude about our past has been pretty ingrained for quite a long time. As you say, it's just become turbocharged, I say, over the past 4 years, really.
Yes.
Thank you for talking about
My pleasure.
Where can people get it? They can get it on Amazon, can't they?
They can,
Can
yes.
you tell us the absolute title? It is, of course, Imperial Measurement. But
Oh, it would be embarrassing if I get that wrong now. It's Imperial Measurement, a cost-benefit analysis of Western colonialism.
well, perfect. There you go. And it's available on Amazon, or indeed downloadable from the IEA website. Is that
Yes,
right?
the PDF is on the IEA website under
great,
publications.
okay. Well, look, thank you once again very much for coming in.
My pleasure.
About it. Fascinating. That's it for this week. We shall be back next week. So in the meantime, have a lovely week, won't you? Bye-bye. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.